Okay, I think I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone, to a new Film Quarterly webinar. I'm B. Ruby Rich, editor, and we are here with you today to celebrate this fabulous dossier and its contributors from our winter issue. That was a dossier on the resilient spring of Arab cinema 10 years after. And I think that was a very important title and one chosen, crafted, inspired by the co-editor of this dossier, Rasha Salti, who's here with us, along with Kay Dickinson, Stefan Tarnowski, and Donatella Della Rata. And it's a very strange day to be doing this because, of course, it is the day of these horrors with Ukraine. But there were other horrors 10 years ago and in the intervening years. So in a perverse way, it may even be appropriate, but I realize that people can never hold two parts of the world in their mind, at least in the United States, at the same time. So we will try to provide an example of how to think globally and regionally, despite what is happening where we now sit, and because of what is happening where we now sit. Before we get underway, I just want to let you know how it's going to be structured. We're going to spend the first half hour hearing from each of the panelists, each of whom contributed a really brilliant article to the dossier. We will then, after that, have about half an hour of talking and discussion between the panelists to deepen the points and to take up issues that weren't in the original articles, but which people want to talk about now. And finally, in the last half hour, maybe even before that, we will get to the questions, concerns, comments, and observations that you yourselves are posting either in the chat or within the Q&A. And that's always like a fundamental treasure of these sessions. So we have a wonderful group of people here and your interlocutors as well. Before we start, I just want to let you know, because I always forget to do it at the end, that next month we're going to be doing another webinar on March 9th with Sky Hopinka about his work, with the article author Diana Flores Ruiz, who wrote about his work in the next issue of Film Quarterly, and with special guest Bird Running Water, who's just left Sundance and has agreed to come from his new post as producer of Indigenous work to talk with us. So that's going to be on March 9th, and there will be a way to sign up for that. But today we are here with this incredible group of participants. And we are going to start with Rasha Salti, who's going to open up with both her vision for the dossier and her own article. And we will then go to Kay Dickinson and then Stefan Tarnowski, and finish up with Donatella Della Rata. Everyone is joining us from different parts of, well, the world, different parts of Europe and the UK. And it's really a pleasure to have you here. Rasha, I'm going to turn the screen over to you. You've been so wonderful to work with us on this. Of course, you're a contributing editor also for Film Quarterly. You've written for us before, but you brought us the idea of this dossier as the anniversary loomed. And I'm eternally grateful. And I'm going to turn the screen to you and let people hear from you about your thoughts at this moment in time. Okay, so if you unmute yourself, great, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in and making time for us this afternoon, evening, or maybe even morning in California. I want to thank Ruby for her trust and her genuine enthusiasm. And I mostly want to thank, I would also need to thank the Film Quarterly team for their patience and mostly want to thank the contributors, Kay, Stefan, and Donatella, who were so generous and patient. And 2 babies were born since the commissions of the article and the publication. So, there's things to look forward to in the background, in the backstage of this issue. The idea for this issue came from a frustration of how what the Arab world experienced, the series of insurgencies that the Arab world experienced, how it was represented and how it was understood. When the actual events happened, I was frustrated because I didn't like the expression Arab Spring. I felt it was, we couldn't have our own thing and we needed to borrow it from Prague. But then I decided to appropriate it because they started talking about the autumn of the patriarchs. And so I scuttled back to reclaim the spring. But I also was frustrated that it was presented as a new phenomenon, and that finally Arab societies were awakening to the cause of democracy, equality, gender, whatever. And this is something that I've been following or studying for quite a bit in relation to writing film history, but also contemporary understanding contemporary art. And I just wanted to start with this point of thinking historically. And in thinking historically, if we look back at the Arab world or the Arab-speaking world, because I guess it's wrong to just imagine a bunch of Arabs living there. There's Kurds, Armenians, Amazigh, and it's a very diverse world. But let's talk about the region. Since the late 70s, or at least since the IMF has imposed the structural adjustment policies, actually these societies have been extremely active, politically active in refusing the very harsh reforms that have been imposed on them. And in fact, the reason the despots became more and more despotic is because societies were fighting back. And I'm not a labor historian, but labor historians will argue that for some of the fights, the actual groups of people, whether workers, students, etc., they achieved some victories. So it's not a whole bunch of like a dormant society that finally goes on Facebook and suddenly realizes that, oh my God, it's time to remove the dictators. That's not the story. Secondly, in thinking historically, and that is the invitation to Kay. Kay has published a marvelous book on manifestos that have been published by different groups of filmmakers in the region. And of course, these manifestos correspond with times of political upheaval, or times of great hope, or times of political uprising, insurgency. She will talk more about this, but it was important to have that memory and that history represented in this dossier. And then there was a question of how do we relate to history, or how does a new generation of filmmakers relate to the archives that they produced, relate to the captures, the documents that they produced during this uprising. And I have been a lifelong fan of Stefan and his work. Every time I can invite him, I will. And Rami Farah's film, Our Memory Belongs to Us, addressed this question head on. And I'm extremely happy that he answered the invitation and wrote that marvelous piece. This is in thinking historically, and then in thinking about the present, or what are what are the symptoms of the I'm going to call them Arab Spring, and if it upsets anyone, we can have an argument later, but it's just for short. What are the symptoms of the Arab Spring? What did that space of insurgencies open up? And I love Donatella's work, and in the process of talking to her, I realized that her new work has to do with this notion of virality, and her take on the relationship of this region-wide insurgency and social media is a fresh one, is a bold one, and is putting on the table questions and arguments that have not been put before. In fact, quite the opposite has been present and argued. So in the space of the art, so I ended up with having to write an overview, and basically the argument maybe that matters to me the most, which is how does the political event relate to changes in perception, in producing images and producing narratives. I think I will address what I could not fit into the article in the second round, but for the time being, I just started with this idea that bodies in the public space are producing a new body politic. And what does that mean? Or how does that change the relationship to representation and narrative in moving image? So Ruby, this is it for me.
Great. We'll come back to you. I know it's not it for you in this session by any means, but we'll move on to UK and to hear from you about the archive, about out in the streets, and about your explorations there on the ground, actually. So
sure,
turning over to you.
Mainly that's in the article, and I might, not touch on it so much today. Sure. But it's an essay ultimately that, as Rasha said, honors the historical legacies that have really nourished these uprisings. And in this essay, I'm looking particularly at Egypt. And like so many people out there, including Russia, but almost anyone who's has a feel and has lived through this or has been studying it, we all want to challenge the prominence that's been given to new media as somehow this kind of primary instigator of the revolutions. And most critics, and very rightfully so, of the Facebook revolutions are people who stress the long legacy of grassroots organizing, of on-the-ground activism. And I actually just wanted to add a tiny bit to that, which is to say that there is also this vibrant film-based militancy that has a long, rich life in the Arab world, and has contributed to these newer revolutions and continues to do so. So it's an essay that's not so much, I would say, a critique of that narrative, but more one that is eager to share a history that's been very much marginalized, not just in the global north, but also sadly in the region as well. So I got a big nudge from Russia at the let's say at the beginning of this project to draw in work that I had been doing on that book on manifestos, which actually, Rebecca, if you could share the. Yes, so it's got a very boring cover, but there's also a link which, Mark, you're amazing. People, thank you for this team effort. So there's a link there if anyone wants to check out the table of contents. And actually, if you email me, I'll just send you a free PDF. Like Manifesto should be free. So as you can see, that's what it's about. It's just to give you a taster, because I hope that the material in it's kind of exciting. It includes a manifesto from 1968, which is obviously a really resonant year all around the world. And it came out before Towards the Third Cinema, although it's a lot less kind of well known. So, you know, there's a little plug for that. There are manifestos that explore how the decolonial kind of revolutionary governments in countries like Egypt and Algeria then went on to formulate a kind of revolutionary and largely nationalized cinema. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are Palestinians writing just as much as they're making films from a guerrilla perspective. So really at the front lines of struggle. And you know, so how do I fit all that into this talk or this essay? What I did for the Film Quarterly essay was then home in on just one film from the Arab Spring aftermath, and which very richly incorporates that history and deals with that present moment of 2011 and its aftermath. So if we could have the next slide, please, Rebecca, that would be lovely. Yes, so the film is called Out on the Street, and its directors were also members of an Egyptian revolutionary video collective called Musirin. You may have heard of them. They also wrote an amazing, very rich poetic manifesto, which is anthologized in the book as well. And if we could have the second poster. So that was the sort of European facing arty poster, but this next image is what was what went up in the streets of Cairo, in the neighborhood where the protagonists from the film were living. So I'm also hoping that, yes, Mark's already done it, dropped into the chat. There's a website for this film. There's a teaser there. Hopefully the whole film will be up soon, and a bunch of educational and further resources. And what I'm hoping to do now is just to encourage people to watch it, to learn from it. And I'll give you some sort of pointers here. It came out of Egypt, and it's a film about the forms of resistance that are possible when a secure, or in this case, a nationalized workspace, it's a film about a factory, when a space like that gets sold off, when it's, you know, its employees are sacked or made redundant in the name of rationalizing or kind of, you know, creating a leaner employee base, or even worse, which is the case here, when that land on the factory stands on becomes more valuable as real estate. So the whole place gets demolished in order to make it valuable, but to completely sort of vanquish anyone's livelihoods. So obviously, these are the structural moves that are very much the fault lines of the Arab uprisings of 2011. But clearly, job insecurity, casualization, all of these things affect millions of people around the world. So I'm going to say this is a film that I think has deep resonances, and the filmmakers find that when they show it in Greece or Argentina, it's incredibly pertinent to those contexts as well. So it's not just a film that represents those struggles, it's also one that asks us about the capabilities of filmmaking to create revolutionary interventions. So how does it do that? Firstly, it's a cast that's comprised of people who aren't trained actors. They're made up of people who are casualized blue-collar workers, the kinds of people that the film represents. And in actual fact, the script was written in collaboration with those workers, and it was drawing on their stories. So for me, that's not just a democratic gesture or a leveling gesture. It's also one that questions the boundaries of professionalization. Who is an expert here when it's a film about a certain group of people? And I think that's crucial for a film that's actually about labor anyway. The narrative is one of a worker takeover of the factory. So that's where it goes. They take over the place. It's an occupation. But in that, it's also a trialing and a testing out of an acting out. The filmmakers call this, their contributors, enactors. So what, you know, in order to be revolutionary, we need to trial and practice these things, and the capacities that film has for rehearsal, for embodiment, for imagination, they are essential to trialing a revolutionary future. So all that seems like it's about the moment and what's to come. Where is this archive? Where is this history? Okay, so firstly, these are techniques that were very much in play in Palestinian militant filmmaking, for example, in the 1970s. And it's not just Palestine. Again, open this out. This is Brecht, this is Peter Watkins, this is stuff from all over the world. So it's a unification of these kinds of techniques and a consolidation and a strengthening. Secondly, it's a film that incorporates footage from different moments in history. So if we go to the next image, I just want to show you, it draws on this film, which is a film from the, this is a lovely poster, I think, a film called The Dark Glasses, which is from when Egypt had a nationalized cinema. And funnily enough, it also pivots around a factory, which obviously a socialist melodrama can do. And I find it really pertinent that the film uses Out on the Street uses the dark glasses, because it's a public sector film. It's a film that belongs to the people. So in a movie that's talking about brutal kind of appropriation of resources, to say, hey, this is the people's cinema in the middle of it. And then
this might be a good time to just interrupt you, because we're going to have time to hear more. But yeah, I want to just be sure to let some of the others, because I reluctantly I say this because this is fantastic, but we're going to come back to this, and just if you could just keep this last part for our next part, that would be great. So cool. This is terrific. I'm going to move on so we hear from Stefan, who wrote for us about Our Memories Belong to Us, this really exceptional film, and also talking about the tragedy of activism in Syria. And just turning over to you, Stefan. I want to hear what you have to say for us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruby, for your kind introduction. And thank you also, Rasha, for inviting me to contribute to this special issue. Thank you for your careful editing, Ruby, and thank you to all the team, Rebecca, Christina, and Mark, for all your help throughout. So my piece for the special issue is really a review of Rami Farah's film. So I'm going to mainly talk about the film, which I hope you all get a chance to watch. And this is a film which is really about taking stock of the last 10 years and thinking about what happened since 2011 in Syria, since the beginning of the Syrian Revolution, and wondering about people's changing assumptions and changing approaches to their actions and practices, and in particular, their practices of media activism since then. So, the setup of the film is really all important here. And I was wondering, Rebecca, if maybe you could show the first image. Yeah, so in the setup of the film, Rami Farah has brought together 3 activists from Daraa, which is in the south of Syria, and it's an iconic city of the Syrian Revolution. It's where the Syrian Revolution really starts in March 2011. And he brings them together, these 3 activists from Daraa, on a stage in Paris, and they bring with them their hard drives from 2011 up until about 2013, 2014. And he asks them to reflect on their images from the past. So that's really the setup. So they're there on stage, confronted with their own images, and their images from the past are present with them. And I think that this setup is all important for creating this sort of site of reflection, this taking stock. And I think, for many of the activists who would have been on stage today, a day like today, I kind of have to say this, but a day like today, they would feel kind of begins in a certain sense in Daraa and in the events of the Syrian Revolution. So for many Syrians who I talked to and who I did fieldwork with, the road to Kiev really did run through Daraa and Damascus and Aleppo, and this was, the first or one of the first Russian interventions and so they would know, they would understand the events of today very clearly. So anyway, I just had to say that aside. So really, he's taking stock on the past, and he's asked, and one of the first questions he asked these activists is, did you really believe that an image of a protest could overthrow the regime? And what he's doing there is he's confronting the sort of pessimism of the present with the optimism of the past. And I think that that's a really important thing, because when we look back on 2011 today, and especially when we look back on the actions of media activists, it's very possible to simply dismiss their practices of media activism as a kind of naivety, as a kind of naive optimism. And in the wake of Brexit, and in the wake of fake news, and the rise of Trump, we're sort of seeing this kind of antediluvian moment, from the other side of a paradigm shift, we could say, and it looks kind of incomprehensible. Rami Farah is there to reflect on the practices nonetheless. And what I really loved about his approach was that despite this shift that's taken place, from the optimism that maybe practicing with new media technologies can bring about change, can document crimes that could be used as evidence in courts, and can even tell the world what was happening in Syria. Despite being confronted with an optimism that we don't really understand today, he sort of approaches these activists with a kind of critical generosity. And so that's what I was interested in the film, and that's what I tried to think about through the lens of tragedy. And so what I was interested in was what I was trying to theorize was a particular modality of tragedy, which is that this wasn't, the practice of media activism shouldn't just be seen as a kind of flaw. A flaw which led to their kind of inevitable downfall. And nor should it be seen as kind of, the defeat of these activists shouldn't just be seen as a confrontation between two incommensurable ideas of the good, or two virtues that simply lead to the downfall of the weaker party. A bit in the way that Hegel describes Antigone. I'm interested in this kind of tragedy, which, to be completely honest, I got while becoming a John le Carré bore, reading lots of John le Carré during the lockdown in Beirut, which was a kind of tragedy where even a character's most redeeming qualities, even their greatest virtue, gets used against them by those in power in order to lead to their downfall. And so this got me thinking about activists in Syria. They were circulating images, and I think that Rami Farah captures this as well in Our Memory Belongs to Us. These people were circulating images ostensibly, or in order to achieve a revolutionary change in their countries. Those images then get used against them as a kind of proof of a secular state fighting an atavistic population of Islamists, and get used to justify the killing of those same activists. So I'm interested in how that ostensibly, or that virtuous act, or that virtue of believing in the power of circulating images and documenting the revolution, a revolution and its crackdown, got turned into one of the causes of these activists' own defeat. So I described this before as a kind of critical generosity, and I think that this is the theoretical intervention of the essay, which is that it's become sometimes common in writing about the practices of human rights video to dismiss it as at worst a kind of naive belief in Enlightenment reason. Like exposure of the truth will lead to a kind of action, and that's a kind of naive faith of our age. It's almost it's almost the sort of a symptom of the ideology of our age, which is human rights or humanitarianism. And on the other hand, it sometimes gets dismissed as humanitarianism gets dismissed as sort of in the thrall or in the pocket of global power. You know, human rights is sort of the discourse of America, and humanitarian activists, sort of in lockstep with satellite TV channels, are effectively just trying to beckon US intervention. And these guys on the ground in Syria, therefore, are sort of the handmaidens of imperialism, despite not necessarily even knowing it themselves. So
I'm going to stop you there, Stefan, and hold these ideas, because this conversation to follow is getting richer and richer. So apologies. Donatella Della Rata, I'm going to come to you next. You contributed a wonderful essay looking at the questions of the shot and the different kinds of shots and what was meant by that. And I don't know if you're going to revisit that for us today, or if you have other things on your mind. So I'm going to turn the screen over to you, Donatella.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And thanks for having me. And I do apologize in advance, because I'm going to be on and off this webinar, because I have my 3-month-old baby in the other room, and she needs me now for, in order to be fed. So my apologies. So I'll try to do my best to wrap it up, or at least to condensate some of the points that I raised in the essay. And maybe I will discuss the final part of the essay in the next round. Hopefully, we will have more time. So the aim of my essay is to insert the Arab so-called Spring and Syria, because Syria is the place where I did my media ethnography, my fieldwork, and my PhD, within a broader cultural and political framework. I want to get the Arab Spring and Syria out of the so-called framework of exceptionalism, although historical exceptionalism has been understood in different ways. But I mean, by this kind of exceptionalism, I mean something by which we say, oh, what's happening in Syria does not concern us, because that's a war zone, that's a crisis zone, and I want people to look at Syria and the broader dynamics at work in the region as something that has a global meaning. I want to say that the Arab Spring and Syria particularly epitomize something like a paradigm shift in understanding data culture, the politics of data, and so hence politics overall. So I am a media ethnographer, so I'm a media scholar. So of course, I put Syria in the framework, and the Arab Spring overall in the framework of the media that tells the story of what was happening in the Arab Spring, namely the internet or network technologies at large. So, my main point is that the Arab Spring and Syria become revelatory of a dynamic that is quintessential to the infrastructure, techno-human infrastructure of the so-called social web or participatory web. If you reflect upon dynamics of violence and visibility, which is one of my main research questions also in the book I authored a couple of years ago called Syrian Revolution. So the book takes Syria as an example of, again, a dynamic which I think is broader than just the Arab region. So if you look at Syria, and I mean the Arab Spring 2011, that's the first networked conflict of all times, going back to other major conflicts in the region or overall global conflicts. For example, Iraq 2003, that's before Facebook happened, and YouTube, of course. So the major social networks all open in the mid 2000s. So I think the network dimension is something that we should definitely take into account when we read what's happening in the Arab region. So my concern is to put Syria and the Arab world in 2011 within a broader dynamic, to use it to look at the combination, the intertwinement between violence and visibility, something that in this book I describe as shooting. Meaning the meaning of shooting is on the one hand, shooting as in filming, on the other hand, shooting as in killing. So it's shooting and shooting at. Something I'm sure you saw, something that other scholars and artists refer to as the double shooting. So people in the user-generated videos coming from the region, filming while they were being shot at by snipers, for example. So this frame of the double shooting, of the shooting and shooting at, for me epitomizes a dynamic of intertwinement, of a new form of intertwinement between violence and visibility, which I see at work in what I call the networked image. So the networked image is a visual and political formation that manifests itself in the context of the Arab Spring. It's quintessentially social because it's a political and visual formation that happens within the techno-social infrastructure of Web 2.0. So the social web, the web of Zuckerberg, the web of YouTube. So it's as I said, it's a dynamic that it's peculiar to the networks, a dynamic by which a jihadi regime officer and a peaceful protester are all equal, are all the same from the point of view of, again, the techno-social infrastructure of the social web. These can be understood as digital labor from the perspective of Silicon Valley or China platform owners, most of the time unpaid digital labor, all have the same capability of uploading and sharing and liking and storyfying stuff over the internet. And I want to add also, besides this human factor, I want to add also a transhuman or post-human dimension within this narrative. The Arab Spring is the first time where we see bots or algorithms or artificial intelligence at work in determining something that is quintessential to the networked image, which is its virality, or to quote Harry Jenkins, a scholar of this field, its spreadability, meaning the extent to which the image is shareable in a seamless way through the internet using different devices, So the more spreadable the image is, the more social it becomes, the more it hits the viewers, and this is a dynamic by which the truth value of the image, its indexical value, its representational value does no longer count. It's no longer important, because what counts from a social web perspective is its circulation. Again, its spreadability or its virality, to use a word that I'm gonna to connect hopefully later to what is happening today with the pandemic, So we see at work dynamics, such as, for example, I don't know if you guys remember the Syrian Hero Boy. This is a short film, which became viral on the internet in the first years after the uprising. In the end, after becoming viral, there was a Norwegian director coming out and saying that he made it up, and its goal was actually to show that there's a lot of what he wanted to shed light on the human suffering of people, blah blah blah. But what I see at work in this story is the algorithmic value of this video. If you read the story back, the first time the Norwegian director posted the video, uploaded the video, he didn't add the hashtag hero. But then he learned through the algorithm of YouTube that the video was not becoming viral. Hence, it changed it into Syrian hashtag hero boy. And this is how, through the hashtag, the video really became viral. So this is to say that also, hashtag, so algorithmic circulation. These are things that we became familiar with now, but at the time were completely unknown. So this is why I say that also when it comes to fake news, or post-truth regimes, something that we became familiar with Donald Trump, or other stuff post Donald Trump. But in fact, this was already at work in Bashar al-Assad Syria. And this is not because of an authoritarian regime being quite smart, into brackets, in shifting the narrative on their side. But again, it's because the networks, the social web is designed by default to put the circulation, the virality as its core value, not truth versus false. So the question of fake news is inherent to the infrastructure of the social web. And
okay. Yeah, I hear you being called. So I'm going to stop here. It's a perfect place to stop. And as we go on to this next section of our conversation, I want to segue by coming back to you, Rasha, because you were so generous about the dossier. You didn't yet get to talk about your own piece. So let's hear from you as a way to move into this next part of our conversation, because you spoke so beautifully about the body and about other issues and what you wrote. I want to give you the chance to revisit that, okay?
Yes. So, I decided that, just looking at the political event, groups of people who knew each other to a smaller scale, who were connected in social networks, whether web-based or not, decide to come together, take a risk together, and stand as a mass to create an aggregate mass to basically recreate a body politic. In what I have observed in the films that have been produced since in those past 10 years, the fact that the body is the first site of contestation, of dissent, and of emancipation has also emancipated the relationship of the body to film narrative and representation. This is kind of the core of my essay. I refer to several films to argue for this. There are a few other examples, or there are a few other arguments that I would like to put forward. Some I touched on in the essay, and it's still the relationship to the body and to the political event. So the political event, what people filmed was their presence together, but also a lifting of inhibition in speech. One of the things that maybe the despotic regimes will never recover from is how their aura was completely destroyed. And I don't remember who said that, I'm sorry, but I guess I'm citing somebody. But basically, this dictatorship have this thing of a double language. The language that is spoken in the street, which is a language that accommodates what the regime wants to claim and allows to be spoken. And then there's the private language that you speak in the intimacy of homes with people you trust and will not get you into trouble. And in the public sphere, in this new body politic, the double language collapses, the structure of a double language collapses. The things that are spoken are the things that were self-censored. In the lifting of this self-censorship, that is also impacted filmmaking. And for example, for the first time, we have an openly queer, openly queer stories, representations, and narratives. There was even a queer film festival in Tunisia that I think started in 2017 and that had to stop because of COVID. And it remains to be seen whether it will be able to pick up again this year. The other very remarkable thing is the transformation of gender, the perception of gender, gender's subjectivity, and also the creation of a gendered language, the appropriation of language and its transformation to accommodate for gendered identities. In almost all of the stories of insurgency, women were in the front rows. Women played a crucial role, sometimes protecting men. And they were outspoken and they claimed their space in the insurgency. So I would have liked to talk about language and gender in my piece, but I didn't have a chance. The last thing I would say is, and this is probably one of the things that I love the most about films and novels after 2011, and it has to do with utopia and dystopia. I mean, there are. I don't think it's right to call it science fiction or fantastical, but basically there's a bunch of novels, graphic novels, collections of short stories, and actual classical novels, and you also see it in film, where basically linear time is completely broken up. The past, the present, and the future are jumbled, and the characters are this Arab Spring did not produce heroes. This Arab Spring showed tired bodies, bodies that are in transformation, bodies that fail, bodies that have wanton desires. And that's something that I appreciate tremendously. I must say that one of the guiding references is a book by Tariq Al-Aris, whom we would have liked to invite to contribute to this dossier, but he's finishing a book. And it's his book about scandal and leaks and how in this web culture, in this networked virality, the notion of a scandal, the notion of a leak, whether it's a leak of a body or a leak of a piece of news, of an illicit video, how they have taken a bigger space in our field of visuality or our retinal culture. Before I stop babbling, I wanted to react to two things that Stefan said, because they're important. You know, when the film Our Memories Belong to Us was screened at Doc Leipzig, it won the award, a very special award, the award given by the city of Leipzig, by a group of people in Leipzig who honor the memory of their revolution. The Berlin Wall, the first uprising against the GDR, against the separation of the two Germanys, and against the regime of former Eastern Germany, or the GDR, started in Leipzig. And it started in a small piazza near a church in the center, in the historic center of Leipzig. And the Stasi were there observing. Everybody in that piazza was convinced they were going to be shot at. It's not clear why the Stasi did not shoot at the protesters. But something happened. A couple of cameramen, photographers, went up, and videographers went up on the roof and took shots. And somehow these films were smuggled to West Berlin and were shown broadcast on TV. And when they were broadcast on TV, the East Berliners saw them. And that's how the revolution spread, or that's one of the ways in which the revolution spread. When Rami was told the story, I was standing with him and we both choked with tears, because we believed that spreading images was going to save us. We believed that spreading images was going to change the course of history. And in 1989, it did in Germany. In Syria, it did not. The second thing I would like to just point to is basically, in the 1979 and 1980, there was a movement of dissent and contestation against Hafez al-Assad, so Bashar al-Assad's father in Syria. And one of the nerve centers of this uprising was the city of Hama. And basically, Hafez al-Assad bombed Hama with extreme cruelty, crushing that revolt. There are extremely few images of the destruction of Hama, and even fewer images of the many protests that took place in Syria at that time. The memory of that uprising or this movement of contestation is transmitted verbally, literally from one friend to the next, from one family to within families, over generations. So it's a narrative transmission. Maybe our obsession to produce images this time was so that we would have a visuality to go with narratives.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rasha. I want to now open it up so that we can dig into some of these points. Kay, I cut you off first. I wonder if you want to take up where you left off and get us started on exploring some more of these questions between you all.
I think less to, because I only had a couple of sentences left, but I think to pick up where Rasha left, in this sort of and where Stefan has centrally concerned, this sense of what the image does. I think what I really valued about the work I was looking at was that it wasn't concerned so much with, look, like, if we show the world this, then this will happen. It was like, in the very praxis of filmmaking and of involving communities and of educating ourselves and looking at the capacities of the medium, we will be already in revolution. And it's that matters. And it's not a propaganda or a kind of projection. All of those things are absolutely crucial, and especially in the way Rasha said in relation to Hama and a lack of an archive and a lack of a body of material to look back on. But that promotional element is something I found slightly put to one side in relation to some of these projects, historical and contemporary, that you could actually, just living in the revolution is to perpetuate and create it. And that's what's also we need to take hold of as well, and not to watch it, but to participate in it. So yeah, I guess that's my starting point.
Great.
So I'm kind of curious, Stefan, you not only are very familiar with the film you wrote about, but you also work very closely with these activists, and I'm curious as to how they see that relationship between the living embodiment of revolution as it is a praxis and what they're showing to the world through it.
Right, and the question is kind of, what is the relationship to revolution and to the past and to their past enthusiasm today? Because I think the reality is that the brutality and the violence of the regime and the Russians in Syria was so extreme that one of the questions I always can't help but ask when I interview activists is like, do you regret? Do you have regrets? The response was just so violent, and it led not only to the destruction of most of the country, it led to their displacement, and it led to an ever narrowing margin for their action. And I think that Rami Farah's film captures that really well. The fact that By the end, I can't remember which activist it is. I think it's Rani does a one-man protest in Daraa, saying that he doesn't want to leave. He doesn't want to be forced to leave his city, and it's a kind of act of defiance. And yet I couldn't help but notice that in that act of defiance, he's still not facing the camera. You know, he's still got his back to the camera, like they were doing in the early protests, because they were scared of retaliations against themselves and against their families. So you see that even in that kind of final, a couple of weeks later, he did have to leave. He did cross the border into Jordan, and he never did go back. And yet so you can focus either on the kind of the brutality and the power of the regime, or on that margin of freedom, no matter how narrowing it is. And I think that Rami's film is beautiful for trying to capture that dialectic and question, and continue to question activists about, just the question you asked me about that issue, in a process that he himself describes as violent. I think at one stage he says, I admit that this was a violent process of confronting people who have lost their revolution, lost their homes, been displaced, like half the country in Syria, probably lost loved ones like Abu Nimr, one of their activist colleagues, and yet you're still questioning, you're still questioning them on their actions. You're still, so it's a delicate question to ask about regret in the aftermath of such loss. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, this is so fascinating because, I love the phrase that you gave earlier, Stefan, when you talked about the optimism of the past and the pessimism of the present. I thought that was just a beautiful phrase. And I wonder what the implications are for images. I wonder what the implications are for the kinds of work that was done then, the images that came out versus the images that are found today, whether they're archival or the kind of work that you found in the archives, Kay, or whether it's new work, the kind that you've been supporting, Rasha. But I just wonder, what are the implications for visual media of that rupture between past and present and between optimism and pessimism? What are the implications? Uh-oh, I think I asked the wrong question. Any part of that?
I guess maybe deep down inside, the motivation that I have for thinking about these 10 years is that I want to remain optimistic. And I do not want to surrender to the pessimism of the present. And maybe it's optimism of the past, pessimism of the present, and optimism of the will. That's or hashtag optimism of the will. But I don't think I think that people mourn their losses, wait for wounds to scar a little bit, but it's not true what right-wing social scientists say. People do not like to live with indignity. And some things will explode. The other thing that I want to say is, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years. These are temporalities. I don't think we know revolutions enough. I don't think we've studied. How many there were? Very few in the course of, say, in the past, 20 centuries. And there's no blueprint for when a revolution is broken, what it produces, whether, how do you determine whether it's failed or not? Obviously, when it produces a civil war and millions, and half or a third of your population is displaced, it's tragic. But I mean, for 40 years, people were living in Syria in unspeakable conditions. I mean, before the revolution happened, Syria was the country where illiteracy was rising, not literacy. I mean, so who am I to decide that Sisi is the outcome of the revolution in Egypt? Punto final. I don't know, right? The waves of 2011 and 2012 were, so it was Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Yemen, and Bahrain, and then Sudan happens, and then Lebanon happens. The speed of this virality, I have not read, convincing political science analysis of. So let's just say that let's not look at hardcore, at political science per se. Let's just look at the lived experience, how people record their subjectivity, what people aspire to, and what has changed fundamentally. In spite of the complete fear, there are some things that have changed irrevocably. And maybe I want to be the wide-eyed optimist.
Kay, I have a question for you. I'm curious, because you were there in Cairo, going into the archives and looking at these histories, and looking at the histories in this earlier moment of optimism, which was the non-aligned movement, and this earlier time of manifestos, how do you find that echoing or not echoing through the intervening years? What was your feeling going back to that moment now and writing for us?
I mean, okay, one thing I will say is that there's a huge gap historically, and I was looking for stuff, and I'm sure it exists, and I wasn't looking in the right ways, as one often does when trying to produce a chronology, but I couldn't find much from the 90s until this moment we're talking about today. And Rasha mentioned the structural adjustment programs early on, and this is the moment when that happens, when the World Bank and the IMF are demanding heavily of the region to privatize, to sell off, to basically render the country affordable to multinational business, and to lose all the the assurances of a socialist-ish. I mean, we don't even need to discuss why that might be a complicated idea, but pensions, jobs for life, full employment, all of these were sort of guarantees supposedly of some of these governments. So the fact that you don't find manifestos in this period, I think is, for me was really crucial. And I sort of skipped over it in some ways in the book because I couldn't account for it, but I still can't, but I just wanted to mention it as this, these moments of economic imposition are really crucial for understanding moments of optimism, I guess. And I just found a quote that I think I actually ended up cutting out of the essay because of constraints, but this was from one of the filmmakers of Out on the Street, where he says, this is to go back to, what does it mean now and how do we think about it? And he says, I think sometimes we get caught red-handed when an opportunity arises to challenge power, and he's talking about 2011. What I try and do is to think about how we can prepare to a certain extent for these kinds of opportunities, to imagine how we might do things differently. And film and many other media and many other kind of registers of life giving that opportunity. So that sense of incredibly depressed filmmakers from Egypt, from Syria, not just depressed, traumatized, but that sense of still preparing, I think is very resonant still. I don't know if that answered, but it was a bit of a riff.
No,
but
that was
back.
Beautiful to hear. Beautiful to hear. And Donatella, welcome back. We want to hear from you, whatever you are in the mood to add to this. We've done our best without you.
Thank you. I was actually listening most of the conversation, and maybe I just want to touch upon the issue of images, because I heard Rasha and Kay, and also Stefan, of course, because the film talks about that, mentioning the role that Syrian activists, not only Syrian, but I mean Arab activists, particularly Syrian, I have to say, the role that they, or the trust that they did put into the image, their profound belief that, in fact, by filming and documenting everything relentlessly, they would kind of trigger some action, especially from this part of the world where we live in. Which eventually didn't happen, as we know. So I want to touch upon this because I believe also I touch upon this in the essay and more widely in my book. There is a difference between what we are, in the history of visual media, we used to call, indexical images or mimetic images, or images that have this power of serving as evidence. A French philosopher, Georges Didier Huberman, calls them image evidence, so images that are meant to provide evidence for a crime or a violence that has been unfolding on the ground. And it's in this deep belief that the Syrian activists and Arab activists overall have devoted their lives to documenting what was happening on the ground. They did believe in the power of images in spite of all. That's the title of the book of Didier Huberman. So he was referring to the Sonderkommando images. So 4 frames, but in spite of all, in spite of the scarcity of the images, still these images bear some, they function as witnesses of a crime that has unfolded on the ground. Well, I do think that in this new paradigm, which is defined by participatory culture, by the techno-social infrastructure of participatory web, images have shifted their meaning. They are now doing something that media theorists and artists Aron Farouki called operational images. So he did believe that contemporary images, they in fact do something. They trigger an action. They are performative in that they are no longer interested in representing something, in bearing witness to something, in showing the truth of something, but they are interested in creating a new world. A world that functions according to different rules that are established by the images themselves. So I think that the networked image that I describe in the essay is definitely an operational image, in that it's no longer, as I was saying before, no longer interested in being assessed according to truth values, it's indifferent to content. If you look at Silicon Valley structure, or China, because Silicon Valley is no longer just the only owner of platforms, but if you look at platform capitalism, what counts for platform capitalism is how many hits, how much the circulation of content, the data stream circulates. So the economy of networked media today is indifferent to content. What counts from the perspective of the social web is circulation, in spite of the content. So the more an image moves around, the more an image is spreadable, the more an image is viral, the better. So the more hits, the more views, regardless of the content. And so I think that this is the tragedy of especially Syria, that Syrian activists, and I have actually lost my best friend for this very reason, because he did believe very staunchly in the image, in the indexical power of the image, in the ethical power of the image. Unfortunately, they have, like, their assessment of the visual regime in which we live is a social web assessment. So the new regime that is defined by participatory dynamics of the social web is in fact populated by operational images, networked images, social images that are defined along criteria of virality and spreadability, no longer truth value.
Thank you for that brilliant and chilling intervention, Donatella. Stefan, I know you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say this is something that I really appreciated in your article, Donatella, which is that you know, I've read a few recent theoretical accounts that try to treat images as events rather than as representation. And I see your intervention kind of in a line with those. And I think one of the things that happened in Syria was that, you know, it wasn't only activists who were circulating images. The regime itself was also in the act of circulating, and in the process of that circulation, some of the typical directions we assume exist regarding images and representation were also reversed. So what I mean by that is that, you know, generally we have an event and then we represent it with an image and then we circulate it, and that's our typical way of seeing it. But, you know, Syrian filmmakers, activists would sometimes question whether that was the correct direction for thinking about how things work or were working on the ground in Syria. Maybe the event happened because because the regime wanted to circulate something in order to terrorize a population. So you commit the crime, the violation, in order to have the image, in order to circulate. So that the direction flips between event and representation, and that means that our theorization has to flip as well. And I see your intervention also as existing in that place. You know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Stefan. I'm going to start taking some questions that come up from the audience that we have here, and this is from Mohammed Hugla Kalfat, and this is something that addresses the circulation of the image in a different way, and it may be something for you, Rasha, talking about the circulation of films, and what about the fact that this work is so hard to see, is so little seen, and is mentioning the work of Lina Al-Abed, and why one film is not available and one film is on Netflix, and what does it mean in terms of what work gets taken up, what work is accessible, and what can be done about it. So we often hear this question, but I think it's particularly acute for this work that you're talking about. Yeah. Do any of you want to answer that, or Rasha?
I'm just going to answer very quickly. I'm tired of these questions. First, I mean, the film festivals have become the alternative space for the circulation of auteur films, or like non-commercial box office films, and each has its constraints, red lines, whatever. And the second thing is that there is actually a network now that exists of independent art house cinemas that also, have included film festivals and cineclubs where content is circulated. I am not so keen on audience studies. So whether a film, has to be seen by 1 million people to have an impact, and whether it needs to be stupid to be on Netflix, I don't want to go there. What matters to me is that this content is available, and actually it is accessible if somebody wants it. If somebody is really, eager, there is more than ever sharing of information about independent film that's available on the web in God knows how many languages. So, yeah, maybe
okay, so
more polite.
we put the burden back on the audience, but Kay, let's hear from you.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is Rasha's, one of Radasha's many jobs, so she's more equipped to answer than me. I just wanted to refract that question a little bit through the themes that we're talking about, many of us today, which is, it's well, at least for Rasha and I, one of the key concerns for these revolutions is about livelihood, about making a living, about surviving financially. And when you ask those questions, you have to consider filmmakers too. And a lot of these filmmakers, Donna's in contact with many of the Syrian ones, and they're very, very keen to do what they can to make money from them, because they don't have a livelihood. These are freelancers who, kind of would like to exist from their films and their work in these ways. So, so if it's through the festivals sort of networks and through Vimeo and stuff like this, where you can sort of monetize it a little bit, then that's the livelihood. On the other hand, how does that then get squared with a certain revolutionary politics? Do you want to put everything on YouTube? And I want to draw us back to a history when there was much more support for filmmakers like this. Even the films that were made by the Palestinian parties, like the PLO, there was a meager salary for these people to do some of their work. And this is not a world we live in now, where people are funded in this way. So to return to the past and think about these models of support is really crucial. And then you have, kind of examples like Egypt, where it was a very popular cinema that traveled the world, was loved by millions, and was supported by the state. So I think I instead of thinking how do we see these films that Rasha's pointed out, we can see them if we try hard enough. Often we need to think about what the questions of material support are, and the same goes for subtitling. Like, that takes a lot of resources. You can't just there's amazing crowdsourced subtitles, but it's work, and we need to appreciate that.
Can I just say that Stefan is one of the most well-known subtitlers of Syrian films?
I have to say, my knowledge of cinema really comes from subtitling, and there's a very particular way of watching it. And I just also wanted to say that in Kay's other book, Arab Cinema Travels, you discuss how actually it's in the process of circulation that these films are made, and the cinema exists beyond the sort of national frame. And that's something that I often come back to when this question about audience gets asked to me, because in fact the question about audience regarding Syria has become really urgent recently, or gets asked a lot recently, like Rasha said, because if you think back to 2011, and Rasha knows this better than anyone, film production was centralized under the National Film Organization. Syria was producing one film a year, maybe one every 2 years sometimes. And then, in the last 10 years, Syria has gone to becoming, one of the global centers for documentary film production. And that's a huge change. And one of the questions that always gets asked to Syrian filmmakers is, who's your audience? Aren't you just making this for an international festival crowd? Are you guys sellouts, or are you just targeting an elite audience? And I think that that's extremely unfair. So I mean, I've seen that question recently directed to, in particular, the films of Bidayat, which was this, production house that helped a lot of young Syrian activists make their first experimental documentaries, so transition from experimental documentary to activism. And their films would do the festival circuit in Europe, and therefore, they were supposedly elitist and sell out and blah, 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 blah. But I think, that ignores the kinds of circulation that these films have anyway within communities, the sort of practices that Kay described so beautifully in her book. For example, the recent film by Abdel Khatib, screening in northern Syria amongst different communities, or lots of screenings in Istanbul that go under the radar. And B, it neglects this question of livelihood that you both, that Rasha and Kay talked about as well. So I'm also suspicious of the question of audience sometimes.
Well, quite rightly. We have another question that's come up as we're coming into our final moments, and this is from Merimona, saying that the question relates more to your essays, Rasha and Stefan, the act of looking back at the revolution and speaking about critical generosity, at the same time the idea of rerouting the original purpose of Rami's photos, for instance, as it's used against them. The failure of the revolution cannot be disregarded as a fact. How do you curate failure in your essays? That's a beautifully challenging point there at the end, how to curate failure.
I don't believe in failure.
Good. Go ahead, Rasha. I leave this to you.
I mean, if the person asking the question wants and needs in their life to have failure, let them have it. I refuse to accept that there was failure. There was something, there was an expectation, there was an aspiration, something else happened. The glass is half full. I say we don't have the tools to measure success or failure. And I just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Stefan, do you want to say anything about it?
So I feel sorry for the questioner because maybe it was me who used the word failure in the first place. But I think look, one of the reasons for turning to tragedy when I thought about this was because tragedy in art as well as in readings of history is about finding ways to reconcile ourselves with defeat and therefore and create a kind of catharsis. So it's about but in the process of doing that, it becomes less, the quote unquote failure becomes less important, and what becomes more important is sort of understanding action as it unfolds and as it's sort of exposed to contingency, and also finding ways to approach that action with what I keep calling this critical generosity. So yes, a way of kind of reconciling us with the fact that history didn't go the way we planned and the way we hoped it did, but not in order to be defeatist or something like that. In order to be generous with ourselves and with our past selves or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, a good response. Failure can be productive, by the way, says Merimona. But I think also this, there's moments when we've been very optimistic, and then that turned out to be misplaced and temporary and not as transformative as we thought. So we kind of swim in the muck of this all the time, I think. Donatello, is there something else you want to add as we're coming up in this last stretch to any of these questions, or something that we haven't yet covered that we should be? I wonder.
Well, I don't want to dig into my own essay. I mean, it's quite, when it comes back also to the last part, it's quite complicated and we don't have time. But I want to just say, because Rasha did mention the centrality of the body in the Arab uprisings, and this is something also I do care a lot about, and I touch upon in the essay, although I'm quite also pessimistic to what is happening to the body, because we have to also see the situation in which we find ourselves today, because of the pandemic, for example. So the ways in which bodies have been confined and isolated, which unfortunately sounds, so far away from the revolutionary potential that unleashed in 2011, so 10 years after. But so my essay does reflect also upon a new kind of body politics or biopolitics that has been inaugurated this past couple of years. And so I see, the 2011, the moment of this revolutionary explosion as one of the last moments so far in which the body has exploded and unleashed its revolutionary potential. So I do think that it's important, though, as Rasha does also in her piece, to bring back the centrality of the body, because I'm afraid that especially in the Western world, Western readings of the Arab uprisings have been very much centered on the internet. If you remember going back 10 years later, before now, we have these, tags such as Arab Revolutions 2.0, or Facebook revolution, or Twitter revolution, or hashtag revolutions, So this speaks into the ideology of the networks, which is very much, I call it a neo-digital Orientalism. So it's a way in which we Westerners try to take agency away from the Arab world. Once again, in history, by saying, oh yes, but the revolutions in the Arab world could not have happened without Facebook or without Google, blah, 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 which is totally unfair. So I think it's very important to restore the centrality of the body in telling the story of the Arab uprisings.
Yeah, really, really well said. Anyone else? We have a few more minutes here. Any film or filmmakers that you want to recommend to the audience that you think, in terms of thinking through these issues, these questions, this decade, is there anyone or anything they should be paying attention to as we leave, with all that you've dug into and confirmed? Yeah.
The filmmaker in question does not talk about the body is not central, or it is present in an extremely interesting way. The film is called The Republic of Silence. It's probably one of the most beautiful chronicles of exile that I have seen in film. It's disjointed. The narrative goes back and forth. And of course, the filmmaker is Diana Gerundi. She's Syrian, and the Republic of Silence refers to growing up in Syria and learning to interiorize self-censorship. And as a child, she's often told to stay silent, to not speak. But the way in which she was able to tell the story of experiencing the uprising and then the expulsion from Syria, and then settling in Germany and learning a new language and making a new life for herself. And so she tells that story through filming her loved ones, her childhood friend, her closest colleague, accomplice, and her partner in life, her husband. The film is 3 hours and a half long. You barely feel it. I know that we will broadcast it on Arte. So, and yes, ideally, people can hack it from the YouTube Arte channel. The title of the film is The Republic of Silence.
Very good. I thought I could hear from everyone, but I'm now, The Republic of Silence is the title. And I realize our time is up, so we're going to leave with that, Rasha. We're going to leave everyone with that as the last comment, and also let everybody know we've put in the chat the dossier, and you can go on there and find the dossier. So thank you all. This has been an absolutely fantastic session. I wish we had another hour and a half with you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.